Good morning. We're going to be talking about expected loss. If you have an exposure in your portfolio, say for example, if you had a loan where you had a certain amount of exposure, what is the expected loss for this exposure? So there is a way to calculate the expected loss that depends on couple of parameters. So if you have like the amount of exposure at the time of default, say for example, if you define that to be EAD, exposure at default, and if there's a probability for this exposure amount to be defaulting, so there is a probability it may default or may not default, or there is a certain amount of probability for this the exposure amount to be defaulted. Say let's define that to be PD, probability of default. And if it defaults, what is the loss if the default that happens? The loss given default. So it's called LGD. The formula to calculate the expected loss is EL, expected loss, is equal to EAD, exposure at default, multiplied by PD, probability of default, multiplied by loss given default. So if you had this exposure that is currently that could be at default, then what is the probability PD? So you multiply both EAD by probability of default. That means this exposure potentially it could default. And what could be the loss given this default multiplied at that factor? So it is all defined by percentage. So if you had basically certain kind of recovery of this exposure, so loss given default could be 1 minus the recovery rate, loss given default. I think it will be simpler if you put that numbers in a spreadsheet. Say suppose you had a couple of loans portfolio. Say for example, in our case we had 1, 2, 3, 4 loans, and you had those amount of exposures at default. The loan one is at we have $10 million of exposure, loan 2 $5 million of exposure, loan 3 $25 million, and loan 4 has 30 million exposure. And the probability of default, say each of these loans have different probability of default. The first one has 5% probability of default, the second one is 3%, the third one is 4.2%, and the last one is 2.85%. And then what is the let's define loss given default for each of these loans. Say the loss for the first loan is 60% in case of a default, 50% for the loan 2, 70% for the loan 3, and 75% on the fourth loan. So the different amount of riskiness. So the expected loss is basically, if you multiply this EAD multiplied by PD by LGD, here basically B13, C13, D13, in this cell, multiply these three numbers will give you the expected loss. So for all these 4 loans, it will be the second loan is 75,000 expected loss. The third loan 735,000 expected loss, and the other one is 425,500 expected loss. So if you sum them all, if you sum it up, it will give you the overall expected loss. And you had the overall exposures of say 60 millions, on which you will have the expected loss of $1,537,500, and which basically you have to keep a expected loss reserve according to the Basel rule. This expected loss has to be kept as a reserve for the exposures. Hope you found this helpful, how to calculate the expected loss. Thank you very much. And if you like this, please click a like button or subscribe this channel. I'd appreciate so that I can create more such videos. Thank you very much.